You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of Indications, a podcast series by the Conference Board. Indications are conversations that take an objective, fact-based look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best, provide insights for what's ahead. I'm Sara Murray, Managing Director International of the Conference Board and host of this podcast. Today's conversation will focus on the Ukraine-Russia war, how Russia views the world, and the cyber conflict threat. Our guest today is Keir Giles. Keir is a British writer and expert on security issues affecting Russia and on the armed forces of the Russian Federation. He is a senior consulting fellow of the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House and a research director with the Conflict Studies Research Centre. Today, Keir is going to share his thoughts on how Western leaders repeatedly repeat the same mistakes over and over again when dealing with Russia, and then we'll look at the serious cybersecurity threats. Welcome, Keir.
Hello, Sarah.
So given your background relevant to this issue, I can imagine that you've been incredibly busy the past few weeks. Can you share what you've been doing to share your messages and your expertise?
Well, you're right, it has been busy. But then, just like relations with Russia overall, the work patterns of Russia watchers like me go in fairly predictable cycles. There are long periods, years, when nobody's interested at all, and then suddenly Russia does something outrageous and everybody wants to know why. And that's the time when we're rushed off our feet. And fortunately for our business model, that happens fairly regularly. So when Russia invades, for example, Georgia, or seizes Crimea in Ukraine, or attempts to murder the Skripals, or finally now launches its war on Ukraine on full scale, that's when we get busy. We've had a range of different people asking us for expertise. That's not just armed forces and ministries of defense of NATO nations. It's also obviously a lot of media work, because suddenly the public is interested in not only what's going on, but why on earth it's happening. And of course, that's where Russia watchers with long experience come in, because they've looked at the trends and the patterns and the explanations for why Russia does what it does over the years, and noted from them that it is fairly predictable and repetitive, and usually it's quite possible to tell what's coming next.
Your book, I mentioned it just before we started, you wrote a book called Moscow Rules, published in 2019. And for anyone who's listening who hasn't read it, they must. It's incredible and highlights how Western leaders repeat the same mistakes over and over again when dealing with Russia. You argue that there's a lack of comprehension to the different Russian approaches to international relations, and that leads to errors in Western assessments of what Russia might do next and how the West can best manage the relationship with Moscow. Any chance you could just give a synopsis of those rules that you describe in your book?
Yes, certainly. In fact, that's something we have done, broken down the rules into some basic principles, a set of 10 basic principles for working with Russia and avoiding repeating all of the same mistakes that have been made over and over again by Western politicians. And that's available online. Anybody can look up the Moscow Rules with my name, and they'll see that they've been repeated in quite a few different places. But what it comes down to, if there's a single underlying principle that governs all of these problems, it is exactly as you summarized it. It's failing to recognize that the principles that drive Russian domestic and foreign policy are so unrecognizable from anything that we take for granted in the West, in liberal democracies, that you have to abandon all assumptions about what makes countries work and how their relationships are governed with their own people and how they work in between each other to understand exactly why Russia does what it does. You need to set aside all of those preconceptions about what is normal or natural or rational, and instead look at things from the point of view of Moscow, of the Kremlin, because it is so very different from everything we take for granted. It's not anchored in any of those same frameworks of fact or history or geography or even logic that we take for granted. And that is where these repeated surprises that have come from Moscow are so devastating. The fact that everybody is over and again taken unawares by exactly what Russia does, even though Russia has said fairly clearly beforehand that it's going to do it. It also lies behind the failure of this repeating cycle of resets, of trying to get the relationship with Russia on a better footing. All of these initiatives that you see from Western leaders, from U.S. presidents down to French President Emmanuel Macron, who's been the champion of resets with Russia most recently. It always fails, and it always fails for the same reason. So what the book tried to do was step back and look at some of the underlying principles that do actually guide Russia's policy, particularly towards the West, not only because, of course, there are a lot of things that are consistent in how Russia treats its own country and its own population, how the leadership interacts with Russians themselves. But the primary focus was what drives Russia to confront the West, why there is this default assumption within Russia that the West is hostile, needs to be confronted, needs to be attacked.
There are 3 rules in the list of 10 that I just wanted to comment on, because in some ways there's some contradictions or some tensions between them. So one of them, you say, don't be distracted by bluster, bravado and bluff. So is the threat of chemical and nuclear attacks a bluff? Then you also say on Rule 6, don't hope for change. So my question is, what can we hope for then? And your last one is, don't think that you can choose whether to be at war with Russia or not. So again, what's the way to de-escalate?
Well, let's take each of those in turn. But before we do, you mentioned contradictions and tensions and differences between the different approaches that you need to take to Russia. And that, in fact, is another of those rules. You have to be comfortable with the fact that there are going to be contradictions and tensions, and that some of the things that you see coming from Russia are paradoxical and contradictory. And one of the things that we have been arguing for a long time is, when looking for a single explanation of what Russia does and why, don't ask binary questions. Don't ask, is it for this reason or that? Because the reasons are likely to be multiple, and some of them, in a Western framework of rationality, will actually contradict each other. Let's take, for example, the question you asked about chemical and nuclear escalation. There are 2 very different things going on there. On the one hand, use of chemical weapons in Ukraine in the war is something that's been expected from Russia already for some time now, because it's a standard part of Russian war fighting. It comes under this bracket of, if you can't win a war cleverly through military operations, find other means of doing it. And the default Russian setting for doing so is engineering humanitarian catastrophes in order to put pressure on the victim to end the war, in order to end the suffering, as opposed to fighting on and seeing their civilians, their families, their children continue to be killed. Now, chemical weapons would be a standard part of the escalation from that, and we think the only reason that they have not been deployed is the successful pattern of US and allied intelligence disclosures, saying what Russia is going to do before they actually do it, which seems to have headed off quite a few of the standard Russian tactics along the way. Nuclear, on the other hand, is a completely different issue. And every time President Putin mentions nuclear weapons, he gets a very gratifying reaction from Western media and Western politicians that go into a flap, not realizing that this is an absolutely standard part of Russian rhetoric. It's a diplomatic tactic, not a military option, because it's part of the process by which Russia frightens off other parties from getting involved in the operations that they want to prosecute. In this particular case, Russia wants to set the bounds of the conflict in Ukraine. They want to make sure that nobody else is going to be getting involved, supporting Ukraine any more than they already do. So the N word comes out, as it does so routinely and predictably, in order to attempt to frighten everybody else off. And of course, it succeeds, because everybody forgets that this is just a standard and repetitive part of what Russia says.
I just want to probe that a bit more, because when you say that actually, when Russia make that threat, it's to frighten off the West and it's to set the boundaries. But there are many others that argue that the West's response of saying we're not going to get involved makes Putin think that the West is weak, and actually makes him be even more thuggish. What's your thoughts to that?
Well, again, there is no contradiction between these 2 things. Yes, how the West, and in particular the US and the UK, treated the escalation ahead of the invasion of Ukraine was a fundamental and absolutely catastrophic mistake. Because effectively, by saying we are not involved in this, we're going to pull out our instructors before Russia invades, so they don't come in harm's way with Russian troops, and we're not going to support Ukraine directly through a military presence. even a no-fly zone was ruled out before the actual invasion. That gives Putin a green light, because it takes off the table all of the worst-case scenarios that might have been in the minds of Russian planners for how this might escalate into a conflict with other countries, which is precisely what they want to avoid for the time being. And it does also confirm that the West is not willing to support its friends and its partners and potentially its allies as well. So over and above the fact that, yes, it sends a message of weakness, it also sends direct permission for President Putin to invade. Now, unfortunately, the only thing that was supplied to Ukraine in quantity before the actual invasion was missed opportunities to actually head it off and deter Russia.
Interesting. Another question that I wanted to ask you, if you think about some of the causes that led to this current crisis, in the past, when Ukraine declared independence, there was nuclear weapons that they possessed, and they agreed to hand those over to Russia, and that was under the Budapest Memorandum of on Security Assurances. I think this was in 1994. And they handed them over to Russia, but in return, they received security assurances from Russia, Britain, and America, which all undertook to, respect sovereignty, independence, and the existing borders of Ukraine. But that provision was violated by Russia's takeover in Crimea in 2014, which put Ukraine in an awkward situation. But didn't it also the response of the West also was a failure for Ukraine, because they didn't come in and support as well as they could?
Well, that's all correct. And yes, there are multiple failures to unpack there. And one of them is failure to learn the lessons from that process. Because even now, even after the invasion of Ukraine, you have some people suggesting that the answer, in order not to provoke Russia, is for Ukraine to be neutral, for it to be explicitly non-aligned, but with security guarantees from other countries. That's being proposed as a solution to the current conflict. But people are forgetting that that's exactly the position that Ukraine was in 2014, and it helped them not at all. It didn't prevent Russia from seizing Crimea. It didn't prevent Russia from launching the war in eastern Ukraine. And it didn't cause any of the countries that were supposed to be guaranteeing Ukrainian sovereignty from doing anything about it. So the neutrality option that is being proposed still now is, in effect, taking Ukraine back to square one and leaving it incredibly vulnerable to any future Russian intervention. It's not an answer to preserving Ukrainian sovereignty and independence.
But equally, also, another argument that was a reason for this crisis is that Putin saw his sphere of influence under threat. He did not agree to the expansion of the NATO bloc to the east. He did not agree in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, when the West committed the alliance to the future membership of Ukraine and Georgia. That was something that Putin and Russia were deeply opposed to. And even on February the 24th, he commented, didn't he, on the start of his speech, that the expansion of the bloc is one of the reasons that he is taking the steps that he is. So if the neutrality solution is not the right one, and the NATO solution is not the right one, what would be?
Well, there are a couple of problems with this idea that it is NATO that is the issue and NATO that is the trigger for Russian action. A lot of people do even now argue, yes, that it's NATO enlargement that actually caused security problems, and without it, there would not have been a challenge from Russia. Unfortunately, that doesn't stand up to 30 years of history and all of the case studies that we have for looking at whether that is actually the case, or in fact, if NATO is a stabilizing influence that prevents conflict. If you think back to the early 1990s, Russia didn't need the excuse of NATO being anywhere near to launch small wars against its neighbors and try to reassert itself over the countries that were newly independent after the fall of the Soviet Union. And if you think forward to the period after the seizure of Crimea, 2015, 2016, the next candidate for Russian military intervention was being almost universally named as the Baltic states. They were expected to be the next victim of Russia. And NATO responded. What it did was put into those countries small multinational contingents, not very many troops, but from multiple different countries, in order that there was no option for Russia of picking off those countries one by one without the rest of NATO getting involved. And the result of that is those conversations about the potential for armed aggression against the Baltic states vanished. We haven't heard anything about that since NATO actually stepped in and made it clear that they would be defended. And that's an indication of how NATO actually is a provider of security and not a disruptor. But there is another question here, which is more fundamental and is more to do with how we think about the nature of countries and sovereignty and independence today. If you take this argument that countries should not be allowed to join NATO because it offends Russia, then you accept that Russia actually has greater rights than other countries in its vicinity. And it has the right to determine the future security and defense policy of other countries. And that's fundamentally contradictory to the idea that those countries should, in fact, be fully sovereign and independent. And there's another misconception that President Putin buys into fully. In these speeches, in these essays before the invasion, he was showing how he absolutely refuses to understand the nature of NATO and what it is and what it does. He was talking about NATO making dangerous attempts to seize Ukrainian territory because he thinks it's like the old Warsaw Pact. He thinks it's an aggressive, expansionist institution that tries to bring new member states in, as opposed to those new member states actually demanding, sometimes begging, to be allowed into NATO precisely because of Russia's behavior. It is Russia and its threats to its neighbors that causes them to want to join NATO rather than the other way around.
Yeah, indeed. So as you observe the current Russia-Ukraine war, why does the West, continue to misunderstand Russia? Because it seems like as long as they do, the situation will only get worse. What do they need to do apart from read your book?
Well, it is, of course, very helpful that Russia does on occasion launch these completely unexpected to most people acts of military aggression or other ways in which they work against the normal, commonly accepted rules of behavior in the 21st century, because that provides the reminder for people and the shock that they need to sit back and look at the nature of Russia and the way it is trying to roll the clock back to a previous way of interacting between states, resurrecting an empire, resurrecting the boundaries of the Russian Empire, which is exactly what President Putin has called for, and behaving with its own population as though it were once again the Soviet Union. And those are the illustrations that most people made to break out of the mindset, out of the idea that actually Russia is a country like France or Sweden and can be dealt with like a liberal democracy that follows the same rules as everywhere else. And it comes back to the point we were discussing at the beginning. Setting aside all of those assumptions about how countries work is essential for understanding what Russia is and how it wants to interact with the rest of the world. And listening closely to what President Putin says, because we do have the advantage that sometimes he's very clear and direct about what he wants and how he proposes to get it. And what he wants is to, as he put it, reverse the decisions of 100 years ago that caused the Russian Empire to fall apart. He wants to reacquire those territories that previously were part of Tsarist Russia. The problem, of course, is that isn't just Ukraine. It's also countries that are now fully fledged members of the EU, of NATO, of the Western community of nations. It's countries like not just the Baltic states, but Finland and Poland, that President Putin and other individuals in Russia who are good bellwethers of Russian policy have said that they want to return. And the critical fact that people need to learn from that is that the war in Ukraine ongoing at the moment is not the war, it's a war. It is one of the series of attacks that Russia will undertake to try to achieve that ambition of President Putin.
So this is not really only about Ukraine, but a wider matter of European security as a whole. Therefore, we've heard Zelensky ask the West for a no-fly zone, and we've heard the West repeatedly state they will not send troops into Ukraine. If this is a wider European security issue, shouldn't their position be different?
Well, their position, unfortunately, cannot be different because the United States, the UK, the West as a whole painted themselves into a corner in the very early stages by ruling out everything that might have actually helped, by ruling out the no-fly zone, which we were calling for 3 weeks before the invasion, when it might have made a difference. if you could have put in place measures which would actually deter Russia from invading, such as, for example, closing the Ukrainian skies, maritime exclusion zones, peacekeepers from multiple nations, that would have been a positive step towards security, instead of which you had the West advertising, once again, what it was going to not do to support Ukraine, which reassured President Putin and his decision makers that actually they could move in with limited consequences. Now, is that sustainable is the second part of the question. And it's definitely the case that NATO, the West, the EU are going to come under more pressure to do something as the nature of the Russian campaign unfolds, as the humanitarian disasters continue, and as the realization dawns that Russia's ambitions are not limited to Ukraine and other countries are, in fact, in President Putin's crosshairs. Now, we do see some steps to shore up the second line of defense, the next line of defense after Ukraine. We see NATO starting to reinforce its multinational contingents in those frontline states. But there's much more that needs to be done if you work on the recognition that actually Putin has far greater ambition than the borders of Ukraine itself.
And what about China? We've heard about this unlimited friendship. What do you think that really means? Is this a new axis? How could this impact US and European business leaders?
Well, unlimited friendship is a nicely vague phrase for allowing China to appear to give support to Russia, but without actually giving too much and getting itself dragged into the conflict. China has every reason to be extremely annoyed with Russia because Russia will no doubt have promised China that this would, as Russia thought itself, be a swift campaign of regime change that wouldn't actually drag on more than a few days. And that, of course, is the driving assumption that organized all of Russia's planning and the reason why the initial stages of the military operation were such a debacle. They weren't expecting to have to fight for Ukraine. So China now is faced with the risk of getting itself dragged into a long and an escalating crisis instead of simply giving the nod to a swift Russian special operation, as they call it. And China will be very wary of doing that because, of course, its interest, does China want to tie its interest in with Russia that may potentially even possibly lose this war and on the long term may also come in for greater sanctions and greater countermeasures by the West? Or would it prefer to keep its freedom of maneuver and its freedom to be more flexible in its relations and make up the third corner of that triangle between Russia, the West, and China? The impact on the US and the EU really depends very much on how China actually navigates this quandary that they have been put in by President Putin's actions and by the failure of the Ukrainian armed forces and civil society obligingly to roll over and play dead. And that is going to be a very tricky decision path for China's leaders themselves, and one which we will still see them navigating over the next few days and weeks as they try to work out just where their best interests lie.
And interesting that we have seen some change in tone and change in language. They've started to call it a war, and they've also talked about how it needs to end quickly. So there is some recognition, isn't there, of how this hasn't played out according to plan.
It does seem that way, yes. And we do see indications that China is, in fact, conflicted on how exactly to deal with this. You see different signals coming from different parts of the Chinese state apparatus, and that in itself is quite unusual and indicates just what kind of discussion must be going on within the Chinese leadership.
We've talked about the West and how the West continue to misunderstand Russia, and as long as they do, this situation will only get worse. We've also touched on Russia's ultimate plan, other tactics the West could adopt in communicating with Russia and the relationship between Russia and China. Next, we'll look at cyber warfare and the threats and what companies need to be thinking about. We're going to take a short break and be right back with more of my conversation with Keir.
Interested in more insights on the current Russian-Ukrainian crisis? Visit our geopolitics hub at conferenceboard.org/topics/geopolitics. Here you can find a range of easily accessible insights in the form of webcasts, podcasts, research briefs, and more. New resources are being added regularly to help you lead with confidence.
Welcome back to Indications podcast. I'm your host, Sara Murray, Managing Director International of the Conference Board, and I'm joined by Keir Giles. So, Keir, we've all read about Moscow's ability to invoke a cyber operation warfare. In fact, your esteemed colleague Samantha de Bendern came on our podcast a couple of weeks ago and gave some shocking revelations that we need to be prepared if the internet goes down. How would we withdraw cash? How would we communicate with one another? Do we need to already reinstall landlines? I'm really interested for you to share what this might look like and how likely.
Well, the lack of any visible cyber activity or lack of widespread visible cyber activity is one of the surprises about the campaign that Russia is waging against Ukraine. It's just one of many, and there are a lot of areas of Russian capability that were expected to be deployed against Ukraine, but somehow haven't materialized. Things where Russia was supposed to be strong in the purely military sense, like the communication structures, electronic warfare, air power, which somehow just doesn't seem to have shown up in the Ukraine conflict. Cyber is another one where before the conflict began, everybody was expecting that there would be cyber operations to prepare the battlefield and also to win operational advantage for Russia. But it doesn't seem to have happened. And a lot of people are asking the question, why? The impact of major cyber operations against Ukraine would be huge. And it's possible, some people are suggesting, that that is actually why Russia is being restrained and is holding off from mounting the campaigns that were expected, because they might expect countermeasures against Russia itself, and Russia might feel itself vulnerable if other people get involved on a deniable basis in the conflict. But in terms of the scale of the impact, if you think back to the cyber operations against Ukraine that have taken place in the past and spilled over and caused consequences globally, we think of malware like WannaCry and NotPetya, which caused billions in losses and massive disruption around the world. And it's worth remembering that that was just one campaign for one objective that spilled over from its original targets and actually caused that more widespread disruption. If there were to be multiple campaigns happening at the same time with the same effect, then yes, it would be devastating around the world for anybody that had not prepared themselves for the impact of those cyber weapons, of that malware spreading. And that, as I said, may be one of the reasons why Russia is, for the time being, holding off. And all of the high-profile activity that we see in terms of cyber is mostly run by Ukraine and its backers, who are carrying out attacks on against targets within Russia itself, for which we see the impact when we try to actually access any of the Russian information resources and Russia trying to put out its version of the story. Now, when it does lead on to an actual genuine cyber attack, we may not, of course, necessarily know what's going on. We may feel the disruption but not understand precisely what has caused it. But it will certainly go beyond the majority of the tactics that we've seen so far, which are primarily about defacing websites and taking resources offline. It would be far more likely to be a more disruptive campaign targeting the back end of computer systems in order to render them inoperative. There have been, before the conflict actually began, waves of support to Ukraine in trying to prepare it for the likely impact of Russian cyber operations. And another interpretation for why we're seeing so little happening at the moment is that that support was in fact effective. And Ukraine, just as in the military sense, was better prepared than anybody expected for cyber attacks by Russia.
And are you saying that there's a likelihood that Russia will conduct cyber attacks against Ukraine only, or it will also do it against the West as a retaliatory measure for the sanctions?
Well, that's exactly the point. Where if Russia conducts cyber attacks against Ukraine only, it may be very hard for them to contain the effects to Ukraine only. And that's where we have to think about the previous examples like NotPetya, which were intended to be of a very limited scope geographically and a limited effect, but actually spread across the whole of the world and have massive impact everywhere. So Russia may be reticent to try to launch attacks like that precisely because they don't necessarily know that they will be able to contain the effects to countries that can't fight back. But in the later phases of Russia's war on the West, I am sure that we will be expecting cyber attacks that are far less restrained. If and when Russia does move on from Ukraine, and if it comes away from Ukraine thinking that at least it has met some of its demands and some of its objectives, then the next stage of the attack on the West will almost certainly include those cyber attacks that are far less discriminating.
And so what do businesses need to be doing in terms of business continuity plans then?
Well, there's a distinctive aspect to how Russia thinks about going about information warfare and fighting cyber that is sometimes underestimated in the West. And that is the way cyber effects, purely online effects, computer network attacks, go hand in hand with Russian attempts to interdict physical infrastructure, civilian telecommunications infrastructure. And in this, Russia has learned and assimilated the lessons from its seizure of Crimea in 2014, where one of the key elements of gaining control over the whole peninsula was gaining complete information dominance and information interdiction, so that the only way people could actually get any information was from Russian sources. And the way they did that was not only in the traditional way, taking over old-fashioned media like broadcast, television, press in the days leading up to the operation, but actually when the operation was launched, taking over the internet as well by physical intervention, kicking in the doors of the internet exchange point in Simferopol, taking over the cable connections to the mainland. And Russia has built on that lesson, and that's what lies behind this intensive program that we saw from Russia in 2015, 2016 onwards, probing for vulnerabilities worldwide in that civilian telecommunications infrastructure, whether it's subsea cables, whether it's communication satellites, fiber optic connections on land. So what Russia has prepared for is being able to interdict those communications in target countries. Now, of course, the main objective may be to try to at least partially repeat the success of Crimea and make sure that governments can't communicate with their citizens and Russia is the only person that's talking to them. But the knock-on effect is going to be enormous. If they do remove access to the internet for large sectors of large countries, and that is precisely what they've tried to do, for example, with the VPN filter malware, which is targeting small offices, home offices, and whose payload is designed to actually remove their internet access permanently, then the economic disruption is going to be huge. And in terms of business continuity, what that means is that everybody that is data dependent or that manages civilian telecommunications infrastructure needs to be prepared for there to be an actual physical attack on them, as well as all of the other business risks for which they might already be prepared.
Gosh, this could have enormous impact. I mean, if the internet went down, the impact on global banking, what should companies, be doing to preserve liquidity?
Well, it's true that the impact could be enormous, and that's precisely why Russia has put in place plans to cut itself off from the global internet. They say that this is ostensibly to protect Russia from cyber attacks coming in from the outside. It also has the aim, of course, of further isolating Russia's own population from news and information from the rest of the world in order that they don't know what Russia is really doing externally. But it would have the benefit as well of, if Russia causes enormous disruption across the global internet in the rest of the world, then it would insulate itself from the fallout, from the blowback, and some of the chaos would not reach Russia itself. But in terms of preserving liquidity, again, it is exactly the same approach as we need to take with everything else, that it is at risk from Russia. And the first step is recognizing that risk. The step is recognizing that Russia's attempt to attack the West will not be constrained to the purely military domain. And they do see warfare in a much more holistic spectrum than that, and will attempt to target economically those countries that it wishes to attack.
I'm going to ask a really stupid question just because I want you to explain to me. But if you say Russia's taken steps to get off, to cut itself off from the global internet, but it would still be able to communicate within Russia. So it would still have internet within Russia, but it would be cut off from everything outside of Russia.
That's exactly right. It's in effect a firewall between Russia and the outside world, where traffic is that attempts to go outside is rerouted back to within Russia itself. And that sounds bizarre, but we have to bear in mind that it is absolutely consistent with Russia's approach to information and how it sees information from the outside world reaching its citizens as a threat. It's always done this. We think of the Soviet Union being a country that was hermetically sealed as far as possible, so people couldn't get a picture of the outside world. And anybody that remembers the end of the USSR will remember the shock that Russians felt on discovering what the outside world was really like. But the roots go much further than that. The roots of this approach to Russia of information as being dangerous. This is a country, after all, that from time to time over the centuries has banned the import and possession of foreign books because they contain those thoughts and information and ideas from the outside, which, if they spread among the Russian population, are perceived as a direct threat to the leadership.
How many other countries in the West would be able to do the same thing to Russia?
It depends whether you mean the same thing to Russia or the same thing to themselves, because let's not forget this is a self-inflicted injury that Russia is considering. Countries in the West will not be set up to cut themselves off from the global internet, because in the West it is a fundamental feature of the internet that free flow of data and information across borders is how it works. And if we think back to the early stages of Russia itself trying to put in place this capability to cut itself off from the internet, it was the tech companies, it was the internet service providers that were pointing out, this doesn't work. If you do that, you will break the internet and everything will fall over and it will be a disaster. But they weren't in charge of the country. So from 2013 onwards, President Putin banged the tech companies' heads together and said, no, you will make it work. And so some of the ways in which they have been trying to implement this look inelegant and disruptive. But of course, we have to remember when Russia goes about doing this kind of thing, the solutions are rarely pretty, but they are effective.
But could the West cut Russia off from the internet?
Absolutely not. No. There's no way that you could arrange that disruptive impact on all of the different ways in which Russia communicates with the outside world, coordinating between the other countries that Russia is communicating with.
And how likely do you think it is that they're considering it or starting to do this?
Well, we know for a fact that they are considering it because they have already had what they call test runs of trying to cut Russia off from the internet. So these are long-standing plans. These are things like so much else in terms of Russia preparing for conflict with the West that have been in train not for years but for decades. And yes, they have had a couple of false starts in terms of trying to protect Russian citizens from information from outside. Attempts to ban, for example, Telegram or Twitter in the past have backfired on the basis of this technological gap in competence between the securocrats who run Russia and determine its policy and the actual technical people who are trying to make that policy work despite the fact that it runs completely contradictory to how the internet works. So yes, Russia wants to be ready. It's giving indications that it may be ready. We won't know until they try it for real how effective it is.
So if companies have investments in Russia, they probably need to write them off now. Would you say that repatriating supply chains becomes one of the more urgent priorities in light of all of these threats?
Well, you would hope that any company that has investments in Russia has always been prepared to write them off. If not, they simply haven't been paying attention to how Russia treats foreign investors, haven't been paying attention to the billions in investment that, for example, have been written off by energy companies like BP, Shell, when Russia simply decides that it is going to acquire that asset and take it away from the foreign investor. That's been a consistent pattern even before this war. Now the situation is far worse. There's a threat of renationalization of assets that are currently held by foreign investors. And that, of course, will only augment Russia's willingness to actually simply take things away from foreigners. But it's not only that, it's also the reputational damage that is caused by continuing to invest in Russia at the moment. If you look at what has happened to Renault over the last few days, they attempted to restart production of their cars in Russia, and the backlash from people who were not content with Renault financing through its tax funds the ongoing war on Ukraine has caused them to rethink again. So any company currently investing in Russia is going to suffer some fairly severe reputational damage, and it's just yet another reason to pull out as rapidly as possible.
Oh, Keir, very, very concerning. I've got two final questions before we wrap up. This conversation has been incredible. Thank you so much for your time. First question. There is an incredible book called First Person, and it's an astonishingly frank self-portrait by Russia's president. It's all interviews with him or of people around him. And it was published when he first became president. And he told a story of one of his early scares. So a rat that he had cornered had nowhere to go and jumped out at him. Having pushed himself into a corner now, isn't Putin just playing out those childhood nightmares? That's my first question. And then the second one is how to break the cycle of the West repeatedly making mistakes with Russia.
I think those two questions are, in a way, the same. Because to assume that President Putin has backed himself into a corner and is now lashing out is to misinterpret how he thinks about the world and the way the world is going. Russia thinks it's operating now from a position of strength, not of being backed into a corner. The reason why Russia could finally launch its campaign against Ukraine is because it had spent 20 years building up to that moment. A decade plus of rebuilding its military as soon as the funds were available. 20 years since President Putin actually came into power, trying to put back in place the levers of state power that Russia needed in order to reassert itself in its vicinity. The reason why Russia is now talking about reasserting the empire is because they think they're ready to do it. This is not a weak country that has been backed into these actions by the aggressive West. Instead, it is a country that is reasserting itself despite the West not actually having realized that this was its ambition all along. And in terms of how to not repeat the mistakes that we've seen so often in the past in dealing with Russia, again, it comes down to the fundamental principle of understanding what Russia wants. There's been the belief again and again that at some basic level, Russia's and the West's interests must coincide, and there must be something on which we can find a common language. But that's to ignore what President Putin says and what Russia does. If instead we are guided by what Russia actually does want from the West of the world, that's a far more solid basis for actually having a conversation with Russia that doesn't lead to these repeated security crises.
Do you have any hope for how this will play out?
More an expectation than a hope. Unfortunately, it's been very clear for a very long time. You mentioned at the very beginning the book Moscow Rules, where I was trying to explain what it is that drives Russia to confront the West. Now, the final chapter of that book was quite optimistic and upbeat. It was talking about the possibility for the youngest generations in Russia actually eventually to bring about some kind of political change in Russia. That chapter was only in there because the publishers insisted that the rest of the book was so grim and depressing it had to have something upbeat at the end. I didn't believe it when I wrote it, and it turns out that it is the only part of the book that has turned out to be off target, and the only part of the book whose predictions haven't actually come true very quickly after it was published. The people who are the best predictors of where Russia is going and what it is going to do next are the cynics, are the pessimists, are the people who look at Russia's traditional historical trajectory and the way it is repeating now, and they don't succumb to optimism and false hopes about how possibly we might be able to salvage the situation. So yes, hope, unfortunately, is not a strategy, and in this case, it is most definitely not a sound basis for predicting Russia's next move.
Keir, thank you so much for joining us today and providing our listeners with all of your insights. It's been an incredible conversation. We've talked about Russia's views and how it sees itself in international relations, what drives Russia to confront the West. We've also talked about the serious threats of cyber attacks and what companies need to be doing now. And thank you to all of you for listening to the Indications podcast. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by experts to provide insights on this issue. We'll cover leading topics in public policy, economics, governance, human capital. Please share the Indications podcast with your colleagues. I'm Sara Murray, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.